is Progress Day exactly? I did some research to check out exactly what Progress Day is, but the show doesn't feel the need to tell you what it is here at the start at episode 4 where it is most relevant, and I think this shows amazing restraint by the writers. Even without knowing what it is, we know that the word progress means to advance, so we can determine that this is some sort of holiday where the advancement of technology and Piltover's prosperity because of said advancements is being celebrated. Instead, the scene focuses on Jayce and Heimerdinger, focusing on their conversation about Stanwyck per Diddley. All Stanwyck ever built exploded or didn't work, but he realised that the future of the city was about everyone working together and made the sacrifice of personal ambition. This is an important piece of information for Jayce, something that will affect his actions in this episode, and this is why I don't think they explained what Progress Day actually is. Had they done so, I believe most people would have taken that bit of information away from this scene, and not the information about Stanwyck. However, the writers still need to show that it is Progress Day and that it is a celebrated day. They also need to show the advancement of Piltover since Act 1, and as such, they were able to draw a fine line, choosing to reveal the wonders of Piltover more as a shot placing the characters than the focus of the scene. Which, notice how this scene is also in a dark room, so as not to distract the viewers with any new advancements while the information is being said. We learn about Progress Day and Stanwyck, and the two feel separated, which again shows the fine line the writers had to walk and the restraint they had when making this scene. The other thing I wanted to highlight in this scene here was that they start episode 4 in Piltover, which ended very differently than the Undercity in Act 1. There is a high from Jayce's success, compared to the Undercity of which we don't know what will happen now that Vander, the person who was holding it all together, is now dead. This is done to build anticipation. We want to know what has happened to the Undercity, and we want to know what has happened to Vi and Powder, and as such, these elements are held back from us to keep us eagerly watching to find out what's happened to them. Caitlyn was not an important character in Act 1. I think she was certainly memorable, but I could definitely understand if anyone didn't remember her. In Act 2 and 3, she goes from being a side character to one of the main characters, and as is usual in Arcane by now, the show uses the technique of introducing, or rather, in this case, reintroducing her through another character, this being Jayce. We're first of all treated to a scene of Jayce and the Kiramans, showing us their repaired relationship, but also loading them into our minds for Caitlyn's introduction. All of the links Caitlyn had in Act 1 are shown to us first. Her parents and her friend, before she is reintroduced, reminding us of her actions in Act 1 and giving us a good sense of where she is placed in this story and in this world. The scene also shows us, again, through natural dialogue, the relationship between her and her parents, and tying this to the career path she has chosen. I think the fact that Progress Day itself is a holiday of sorts is foreshadowing for the fact that something is probably going to go wrong. What's great about this scene is that we still don't know exactly what has happened to the Underground, and purposefully, rather than showing us a scene in the Underground directly, the writers give us hints and bits of information first. We want to know what has happened, as the Underground was the majority of where Act 1 took place, and the writers know this. This makes scenes more interesting to watch as we are trying to glean any piece of information we can to find out what might have happened to Vi or even to Powder. And as such, we start to learn here that Silko's reach has spread further, as he is now shipping Shimmer to either Piltover or other locations via the Hex Gates, or both. And also that the Underground is no longer united, with this new gang, the Firelights, attacking Silko's crew. I also didn't notice this in my first watch, but the Firelights don't kill anyone. In fact, they go to great lengths to make sure all their weapons are non-lethal, something which is important for when you find out who the Firelights leader is. Being able to satisfy the reader or the viewer is perhaps one of the most important things in writing. If you can satisfy your audience, then you can get away with almost anything. But on the other end of the stick, you also have to worry about something being unsatisfying. This is one of the things that can happen when making false promises. For example, if there is a secret about a box, and we learn lots of little bits of information about that box, we're naturally going to assume in the story that that box will be opened at some point. And because of that, we anticipate it. We anticipate what we're going to find in that box. But if the story ends and that box is never opened, it's unsatisfying. An example in Arcane would be the flare in episode 3. We know this is a promise that Powder is going to use that flare at some point. Well, a smaller hidden promise is made in this scene, and this is the promise we're going to discover at least some sort of information about Powder. The writers purposefully show us a scene before showing us Powder, Vi, Silko, or anything in the underground, basically dangling a carrot in front of us in order to build up our anticipation. And oh, isn't this a far more exhilarating scene because of it? If the drawing on the ceiling didn't confirm it, the "she's here" from the man does, but this is said along with fear that you can hear from the men, and along with their actions build up in our minds what Powder could be like now. And in fact, the foreshadowing in Act 1 also helps build up Powder in our minds for this moment. We've always assumed that her toys will work one day. I think the monkey toy at the end of Act 1 is supposed to symbolise that Powder has reached a level where her toys now work. And we already know she's a great shot. We've known that someday she will become someone that can stand side by side with Vi. And the words and actions of these men confirm this, but in a darker way. We knew the dangerous part, but now we know she's become someone who is feared. And Arcane builds up this image of Powder in our minds before she is revealed, all of it coming together with the swing, a reminder of the innocence Powder once held, the child she was, contradicted with the boom here, symbolising Silko's corruption of her. And finally the reveal. Longer hair to show that she is now an adult. Still young, but an adult within the realms of responsibility and the story. Her attire is very different from Act 1, emphasising the rebellious nature of Silko and the gang she is now in. And white skin, which emphasises the colour palette on display and the new tattoos down one side. We can still see the child Powder here, but we can also see just how much she's changed. And I should mention that, spoiler, the Firelight's leader is Echo. Him being masked in the scene is important. I don't think the writers had him masked and his voice changed just so they could make a shocking reveal later on in the story. They had him masked here because it would have hurt Powder's reveal and the eventual showdown between Powder and Echo on the bridge. Had he been revealed here, our attention would have been taken off the underground and the bits of information the show is trying to tell us and put onto Echo. He would have been considered the focus of the scene. And remember what I said about something being unsatisfying? Well, we wouldn't have found out anything about him other than him being the leader of this gang. The focus of the scene would have been on one thing, while the scene tries to do another, almost like telling us to look to the left, while all the interesting things are happening to the right. And when he sees Powder, we would expect something like the scene on the bridge to happen between the two, which would be less satisfying without the build-up or stakes or anything that we were treated to in that scene. Powder is almost like an unstoppable force in this scene, really highlighting how she's now on par with Vi, and this is important. Her being a League hero notwithstanding, we need to know how strong she is compared to the other rank and file characters, so that her actions later in the series are not stretches of the imagination. Basically, if Arcane can convince us that Powder can do something, then she can. And Powder is only stopped when she's reminded of Vi. Again, the music from this scene emphasising her messed up emotions. This also showing us how messed up she has become from her experiences in Act 1. In Episode 2 we learn a lot about Heimerdinger, and how old he is and how weary of magic he is. I like the themes that come up here and the conflict that starts in this scene that soon spirals out into the rest of the series. Heimerdinger is 307 years old, and will likely outlive Jayce and Victor. He doesn't understand what 10 years means for a human, but he also has some good points that going too fast can be bad, and especially the point on safeguarding the hex tech so it doesn't fall into the wrong hands. But I think a lot of these valid points are shrouded by not understanding what a human's limited lifespan means to them. I think as this scene plays out, we can feel the disappointment along with Jayce and Victor because we want them to do well and we want the technology to advance even more. And Heimerdinger doesn't even seem to realise that he has invited this conflict, as he is simply doing what he feels is best. I've seen so many shows where conflict just feels forced, and when it feels forced, it really takes you out of the experience. It takes you out of the show, because you start questioning the show and would these characters really do that, for example? But in Arcane, it just feels natural, taking into account all of these characters' past and experiences in order to create this conflict. Imagine if this scene with Caitlyn had been the first scene with her in Atoll. I think this highlights how good Arcane is at introducing characters. If Caitlyn hadn't been introduced via Jayce, I can imagine another show giving Caitlyn her own scene before this. Perhaps one where she is getting ready for work and has a fight with her parents about her job. The scene would have been longer than the one she was actually introduced in, and wouldn't have shown her relationship with Jayce. This scene also reintroduces Marcus as sheriff, now having been promoted and seemingly still in Silko's pocket. But it's great how the show doesn't outright tell us this. We can determine it by how no one seemed to be allowed on the ship, and how he sent the thug straight to prison without even interrogating him like Caitlyn was trying to do. And now we have been given all the little bits of information about the underground. Arcane is finally ready to show us its first scene located there, finally revealing what the underground has become under Silko's influence. More lawless, but seemingly also more prosperous and lively. Savika here is not so kind to Powder, which we saw in an earlier scene, but her reaction to Powder is not to be unexpected, considering how Powder was responsible for her losing her arm in Act 1. And again, subtle dialogue here from Silko.
Who's we?
Who's we? Without it being said, it's easy to feel protective nature coming from him in this scene. And straight after, we see firsthand the relationship between Powder and Silko. He asks her what happened, wanting to hear it from her, meaning he trusts her and has faith in her. And Powder casually hanging out in the rafters of his office shows how close to him she is. Something stronger than just boss and subordinate, almost something more like family. Silko even hands her the object he uses to inject shimmer into his eye, putting himself in a vulnerable state while Powder uses it on him. And Powder even rests her head on his, kind of like how Vi did with Powder before. The main objective of this scene was to show the relationship between these two, and Arcane definitely nailed it there. I mentioned in episode 2 that Mel was purposefully introduced without any links to anyone. And again, in this scene we are reintroduced to her before Jayce, not through Jayce. We know she wants to put Piltover on the map, which she has done, but why exactly, and to what ends is she willing to make her ambitions happen? That's what makes these scenes all the more interesting with Jayce. She's trying to manipulate him, but to what end? And will that end be beneficial to Jayce or just her? I want to go back a little bit and mention how Powder, or rather Jinx, is introduced, and how that can be important and set the tone for a character going forward in the story. Jinx was introduced as being dangerous and strong, but at the same time being a loose cannon. She loses control in her first fight, which does a number of things. One, making us care for her, as we can still see Powder within her, that she is not this evil person, but scared and afraid due to her past experiences. And second is akin to showing us that she is a ticking time bomb. She's strong enough that she was able to fight off the firelights by herself. However, this strength is unreliable, something that is likely to cause chaos when it goes off, and almost saying to us that it will happen again because you don't introduce an element to a story that you aren't going to use again. But I wanted to bring this up now because this is the first time we start to see the mental issues that Jinx is facing. And in this scene, we see stuffed dolls of Milo and Clagger, who used to be her family, and we see her hearing their voices in her head. Now, it's still a little too early to say really too much about this, but what I can say from this scene is you notice that Milo's voice is clearly more negative, Milo being the person who berated her in her past, and whenever she is shouting back, it's always due to something Milo has said, whereas Clagger seems to be a more positive reinforcement voice. Very likely these voices taking on the roles that Milo and Clagger kind of used to take when they were alive and they were a family and all together. Powder is worried that Silko will abandon her because she failed. Her annoyance with Seeker from earlier appears to be less about rivalry and more about making sure that she is the most useful one to Silko, so that she'll never be abandoned again. And to that end, she's willing to do something big. She knows that Silko has a problem on his hands, and she wants to be the one to offer him up the solution. Jayce is conflicted here. Heimerdinger has been his mentor and has looked out for him for years. And Jayce wants to take Heimerdinger's advice seriously. He believes that the Hex Gemstones are ready, but he's also young and doesn't have the wisdom and experience that Heimerdinger has. And in the void that Jayce's father left, it's not unlikely that Jayce looks towards Heimerdinger almost like a father. Victor and Mel believe the gemstones are ready, and they believe Piltover needs to look forwards, and Jayce shares this belief, but it's hard to say no to a father's wishes, especially a father you look up to. As Jayce found Mel at the party, it's not unlikely to believe that she has influence on him, like Heimerdinger does, and these two influences are pulling at Jayce from separate sides. And thus far we can tell that Mel's influence is weaker than Heimerdinger's. But like the scenes in episode 1 with Powder's toys, this is a form of foreshadowing for a moment in the future where Jayce will need to choose between Mel and Heimerdinger. In the very first scene, Stanwyck Padiddley is brought up, mentioning that he was not remembered for his inventions, but sacrificing his personal ambitions to try and make everyone work together. The conversation with Heimerdinger had an effect on Jayce, and like with the speech we can see it clearly here, where he is trying to do the same thing, and this clearly has a large effect on Heimerdinger. And going to Mel, I could definitely imagine this scene from Mel's perspective. Knowing what we know about her by the end of the season, you can see her scheming. Jayce's vow is not one that she wanted to hear. If this were a battle between her and Heimerdinger over who could win Jayce, then it would seem like Heimerdinger's victory. But somehow she pulls everything back, calculatingly using Jayce's vow to pull in Heimerdinger and get him to vote on her plan. Caitlyn wants to make something of herself without needing to use her parents' power. I love how intricately woven all these characters are to each other. Caitlyn, who was Jayce's friend when she was a child, saw firsthand how he made himself up to be something from basically nothing. And it's very possible that her decision to go against her parents' wishes and become an enforcer was influenced by this. Without Jayce, she might have taken a completely different path, which speaks loads about how much she respects him in her mind, and also hurts just as much when she calls him counselor rather than his actual name. And finally, just a brief bit on the end here. Vi's introduction here is not really an introduction, more of something to keep us watching for the next episode. But this is the last thing we've been waiting for since the start of the episode, to know what happened to Vi and where she is. Going back to when I spoke about satisfaction, her being revealed here is also fulfilling a promise that was made to us, that we will find out what has happened to her. So this is a character map for episode 4. I've added all the new bits in red, but as this is becoming ever more complicated with each episode going on, I decided to make a new character map using just what happens in this episode to make things a bit more easier to see. In this new character map, we can see that Jayce's stuff is largely unchanged. In fact, Jayce is definitely the main character here that you can kind of tell by all the arrows that are going off by him. All these characters were introduced from Jayce's perspective, which is by far the most out of any character in this episode. Some other interesting things to glean from here. Mel again is not introduced by any character, putting her just by herself, which again I mentioned was for reasons of keeping her motives hidden, so that we question about her place within this world in this story and what she could be plotting and everything. As well as Mel, in this episode, Jinx is introduced via the Firelights, which puts her as more of an antagonist in this episode, which we do know. And Jinx, there are a lot of links coming off Jinx. She is kind of the second main character of the episode. And most importantly, she has the main link going up into Jayce, where she steals the gemstone. She's like the main connector into Piltover, the person who is creating all the conflict that's happening in this story. Well, not all the conflict, there is still Silko, but sparking off all the conflict, basically. And we can see here that Jinx steals the gemstone from Jayce. She almost kills Caitlyn, and Silko is now like a father figure to her, whereas Silko just has his agreement with Marcus. I thought it was apt to do a new character map here, since this is the start of Act 2, which would kind of be like Book 2, but more importantly because there has been a time skip in the story. But despite there being a time skip, we were still introduced to a lot of characters, so it's interesting to see like how Arcane decided to reintroduce these characters. Again, mainly using Jayce to reintroduce these characters, whereas the Undercity, of which the characters did have less of a focus in this episode, they weren't really all introduced by anyone in particular down there. The Firelights introduced Jinx, and Savika kind of introduced us to Silko in that scene. But apart from that, there was not too many characters actually in the Undercity in this episode. Well, that's been my analysis of episode 4. I always seem to have a lot more to say about the start of a story, where things are being set up, where it's interesting how scenes are portrayed to us, how characters are introduced to us, and where all the dominoes are set up in the story for them to eventually all be knocked over. I hope you enjoyed that. If you made it this far, thank you very much for watching. This has been That's It for Rich, and I will see you in the next one.